Good evening, everyone. How is everyone doing today? I like it. Awesome. Awesome. So, hi everyone. My name is Shaina. I'm the Vice President of University Relations for the Simon Fraser Student Society. And I just wanted to welcome you all here today for the federal election debate. We are pleased to have you all here and looking forward to the fruitful and hopefully interesting discussion that does ensue. So before we get started, I would just like to do a territorial acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the traditional, unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, and Katzie nations on which we are privileged to live, work, and play. Unceded means that these territories were never handed over, sold, or given up by these nations, and we are currently situated on occupied land. All right. And one more thing before we get started, I would like to do a brief safety briefing for you all too. So if you encounter an emergency, please just call 911 or find one of us in the blue badges. If everyone wearing this could please raise your hands, that would be nice. Thank you. So just find us. And we're trying to create an active bystander type of environment here at SFU. So if you see something, please do say something. And that is all from me. So now I would like to invite Giovanni and Matt to officially start the event.
Greetings, everybody. So thank you all for coming. Is everybody feeling good? So just an introduction, I'm the president of the Simon Fraser Student Society, and we represent 26,000 undergraduate students on campus and provide resources and services to benefit, connect, and represent our membership here on campus. We hold events, we do advocacy, and we try to make people know that we exist here on behalf of the university, on behalf of the students here on campus. And I just wanted to let everybody know that it's all about civic engagement at this event, and I really thank you for coming. And Matt?
Hey, I'm Matt McDonald, and I'm the Director of External Relations for the Graduate Student Society here at SFU. We represent about 4,500 grad students on campus, provide services to them, and advocate on their behalf. And let me say, it's a pleasure to see so many people in here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. So one short programming note before we begin. You may have noticed we don't have a candidate from the other main party, the Conservative Party, on stage. We did go to great lengths to make sure the candidate knew she was invited, but unfortunately we did not hear back. So just wanted to let you all know if you're wondering. So we are now pleased to begin the SFSS GSS 2019 federal election debate for the riding of Burnaby North-Seymour.
And without further ado, we would like to introduce Oliver Schulte, who will be moderating the debate for us. Oliver is a faculty member in the Department of Computer Science. He runs a lab on sport analytics and is all about numbers and is an avid participant in our democracy. Oliver has voted for all the parties here before. So civic engagement to the max. So please welcome everybody, Oliver Schulte.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I think we'll all learn a lot tonight and maybe have some fun as well. I also wanted to ask for a round of applause for our three organizers. We have 3 organizers, 14 volunteers, 3 security people, 1 TV crew. It's a big production, so let's have a hand for those folks together. Yeah, so I'd like to have this debate in a respectful environment, so please don't interrupt the speakers. Please don't interrupt each other. Don't call anyone any names. And if the audience gets out of hand, we may have to terminate the event. If the candidates get out of hand, we may have to terminate the event. So I would like to introduce the candidates. I will start with the Liberal candidate for Burnaby North-Seymour in the middle, Terry Beach. He is the sitting MP for the riding since the 2015 federal election and is running for re-election. So welcome, Terry. So next, right here on my left, is the NDP candidate, Sven Robinson, who is a former member of Parliament here in Burnaby and served over 20 years. He is now returning to politics and running in this year's election. Welcome, Sven. And then we also very cordially invite SFU Dr. Amita Kapner, who's an astrophysicist, recently graduated with her PhD from SFU. Amita is a newcomer to electoral politics. Did I say something wrong?
I didn't get my PhD from SFU, but thank you.
Okay, my notes are wrong. And she represents the election. Welcome, Amita. Okay, so I'm going to say a bit about the format of the debate. First, we're going to have pre-scripted questions from the organizers. The last half hour, we have audience participation. To make sure everyone in the audience gets a chance to give input, we're going to use a website called slido.com. Let me see. So Slido, slido.com. You have the code there, so when you go to it on your phone, you can enter the code. And then if you think of a question that you would like to have the candidates answer, you can enter it, and you can also vote on other people's questions. So you can ask questions and vote on other people's questions. So please, concise, respectful, think about how Donald Trump would write a tweet and then do the opposite. Okay? And students whose questions are selected will get bonus marks. We're going to start with a set of opening statements from the candidates in alphabetical order. So because this is a student-focused event, we'd like you to briefly introduce yourself and tell us how you would work on student issues if elected, and in about 90 seconds, please. So we'll start with Amita, please.
Thank you. I first would like to echo the acknowledgement that we are on unceded territory and add that colonialism is ongoing. We have ongoing genocide, and so it's up to all of us to keep at it. My name is Amita. I'm the Green Party candidate. I have just received my PhD in astrophysics, but it was from the University of California, Santa Cruz. So up until June, I was a student, and I've been a student for all my life. I now am the Science and Innovation Policy Critic for the Green Party. I've been working on science policy, how we fund science and innovation, and also on artificial intelligence and emerging technologies and what we're doing with the upcoming revolution there. In terms of student issues, that really has been my life. I was in the TA union fighting for pay, fighting for rights, and I worked in diversity more than anything else. So I was the president of Women in Science and Astronomy, or Women in Physics and Astronomy. I was also in Women in Science and Engineering group. So in that, we worked on gender diversity as well as every form of diversity and actually creating an inclusive space. I, as a non-binary person of color, I experienced the academic world as a very off-putting, exclusionary place, and politics is very similar. So what I'm going to be working on is these same issues, because they carry forward everywhere, getting tuition, free tuition for everyone, and bringing the diversity lens into politics. Thank you.
Next. Sure, thank you.
Thanks very much, Oliver, and I too want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It's great to be back at SFU. I have to say I was just here yesterday in solidarity with students who were calling for a tuition freeze, and I also look forward to the day, hopefully in the not too distant future, when post-secondary education is part of a continuum of education, and in fact is tuition free as well. Student issues. So maybe something about myself. Oliver mentioned I had the honor of representing Burnaby for a little over 25 years, and Simon Fraser University was always part of the constituency. It's a great university, and certainly when we talk about issues, student issues, the issue of access to education, of course, is front and center. The issue of student debt, which is devastating for many people, is front and center. But student issues are also human issues. And so I'm looking forward to an opportunity to talk about the key issues that I see as being front and center. The climate crisis, the future of our planet, what kind of planet are we leaving to our children and our grandchildren, the issue of growing inequality, massive and growing inequality, lack of affordability in housing and so on, and then certainly, and finally, an issue that directly affects every student on this campus and every person on this campus, the threat of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which must not go ahead.
Hi everyone, my name is Terry Beach. I'm your Liberal candidate. I've also been your MP for the last 4 years. Simon Fraser is like a second home to me. It's actually been a huge positive experience in my life, and I hope it's going to be the same for you. I started my first business here. I graduated in business economics here. I met my wife here, and I've been on the faculty here for the last 10 years. In fact, the last thing I did before I left SFU to run for office was to work on re-engineering the entrepreneurship program so that every student get access to entrepreneurial education no matter what faculty you're in. And if you look at my background, my entire life has focused on either education or entrepreneurship. And the thread that puts those two things together is that those are both empowering forces. I got into politics because I wanted to make sure that everybody had a real and fair chance at success. And if you look at the Liberal platform and what we've done through the last 4 years in terms of our environmental policy, doing more in the last 4 years than any government has ever done previous, in terms of growing the economy, lifting 900,000 people out of poverty, having the lowest poverty rate and the lowest unemployment rate in the last 50 years, you can see that we're making choices to invest in Canadians, invest in our positive future, and we're hoping to do more of that, and I look very forward to engaging with all of you on that tonight. You did say something about students, and so we did increase student grants by 50% over the last 4 years. We're going to do more, and we cut student loan interest as high as prime plus 5%, now it's a prime.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll get into some of the issues you already raised pretty much right away. So the first section of the debate is around questions regarding the federal government's role in post-secondary education, including tuition. For this question, let's see, each panel will have 2 minutes. It's addressed to everyone. Canadian undergraduate and graduate students pay far more in tuition fees, textbook costs, housing rates now than 20 years ago. And given this fact, what can the federal government do to give financial relief to students? In the short term, should tuition be frozen at current rates? So maybe we can go in the same order as we did before. That's great. Mika?
Tuition needs to be free, and I'm going to risk using up my 2 minutes to do this, but I'm going to list the countries in the world that provide free tuition. Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Germany, Scotland, Slovenia, Czech Republic, Greece, Hungary, Turkey, Estonia, Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, Morocco, and the countries with nominal fees, Mexico, Switzerland, Austria, France, Spain, Belgium, and Luxembourg. So why can't Canada be one of those as well? Education is a human right, and therefore we should be providing it for everyone. There's really no reason for us to not. In the interim, not having the power to institute this immediately, we need to freeze tuition where it is, lower it, and address the fact that living as a student is hard because we are also in an affordability crisis. And so if we really want to say that we're a progressive nation, we need to focus on education, on making sure that everyone has an equal chance at life. and that starts here. And so other than just universities, our plan would be to include $10 billion to fully fund everyone's education, be that post-secondary education or their training programs. Thank you.
Sven next.
And I want to thank Amita for listing those countries, because in fact, that is very much the position the Democrats have taken as well. Our leader, Jagmeet Singh, has said clearly that we must move towards tuition-free education as part of the continuum of education, and actually starting from early childhood education, because that's the other very important piece. I think we want to look clearly at tuition-free education, moving away from a system of loans to a system of grants. And by the way, the other, I think, very important policy issue that we have to look at is following the lead of a number of provinces, including British Columbia, to say not that we're going to have interest at prime, but why should students be paying interest at all on their student loans? It seems to me we should get rid of it. And that's a policy that we're pushing as well. And finally, let's remember that as a student, yes, of course, tuition is a serious issue, but all the other costs, the costs of affordable housing, the costs of childcare, and for too many people, the absolute lack of availability of housing. Because since the Liberals, shortly after the Conservatives killed the National Housing Strategy in the mid-1990s, there hasn't been a single unit of federally supported housing built either. And that affects every student in this country as well.
What I studied when I was here at SFU was economics, and specifically developmental economics, the study of how countries create wealth. And if you go through all the history of time, in order to have a successful nation, you need to do two things. One, you need to produce things that other countries want. And back in the day, that might have been spices or gold, but more today, it's technological services and goods. The second thing is you need to invest in a strong and empowered middle class. And those two things are exactly what everything in the Liberal platform is focused on. The reason that you need strong education is so that you can have the world's most successful workforce, so you can compete globally, create the world's best products and services, and export those things so we can all have a better quality of life. While free tuition sounds good, all those countries that are listed, there's kind of a 50-50 view on how things are going, because you have to look at the downside too. If you take $200 billion out of a revenue stream out of universities, all of a sudden you have a lot more people in classrooms. You have people taking degrees that they're not necessarily completely invested in. You have people taking degree programs when they could be taking trade programs, as an example. So it's not a panacea. But what we've done is we've made sure that education, anybody that wants to get an education can access an education. And we did that by increasing student grants by 50% in our first year. And if we're re-elected, it means that we're going to go from, I think it was $2,000 a year when we first started, went up to $3,000, and now $4,200. Am I out of time? No? Oh, sorry. And now $4,200. We're going to make sure that after you graduate, you get 2 years where you don't have to worry about paying any of your student debt. If you have a child, it's going to be interest-free for 5 years. And so the average student debt right now is about $27,000. We need to make sure that goes down. We also need to make sure that every single Canadian can access a world-class education, and we're going to make sure that's possible.
Great. We can have a brief rebuttal.
I just wanted to, Terry talked about if we move to tuition-free education, that would take $200 million out. That's not where, sorry, $200 billion, he said. The reality is that politics is about priorities. And the fact of the matter is that if, in fact, we move to tuition-free education, and if we had a tax system in which, for example, the wealthiest paid a fair share of tax, so a wealth tax, for example, on the estates of over $20 million, a much fairer tax system, we wouldn't be taking that money out. What we'd be doing is, instead of that tax system benefiting the richest and the most powerful, the 87 families that control more wealth than 12 million Canadians, we would be saying our priority is putting that into post-secondary education and strengthening post-secondary education, not taking the money out.
So our next question is this is a question about, follow-up question about tuition, and particularly domestic versus international tuition. So the provincial government has capped domestic tuition hikes at 2%, but there's no cap on international student tuition. The gap between international and domestic tuition has become huge. International students last year at SFU faced hikes of up to 20%. If you look at it since 2001, their tuition has tripled. And a lot of that has to do with the government funding that the university receives, or perhaps the lack of government funding that the university receives. So do you think international students should be treated differently than domestic students when it comes to government funding? Should federal policymakers do more to address the financial challenges international students face? So what? So let's change the order. I would say we'll go with Terry first, and then we'll reverse. Sven.
First,
and about 1 minute, please.
1 minute. Well, first, let me take issue with the premise of your question, saying that the federal government today does not prioritize post-secondary education, because nothing can be further from the truth. And the fact is, we have a lot of progressive people on the stage right now, and we do not have the conservative candidate here. And if you go back to the Harper years, there was nothing going into post-secondary education. When we got into office, we started coming to something called the Strategic Investment Fund. It was billions of dollars invested into capital infrastructure at universities, so you could have things like energy centers and nano labs and science and research facilities. When I was running for office in 2015, there were scientific researchers telling their students that they couldn't possibly suggest that you do a degree in science or pursue a career in science. We've turned that around. We've put $10 billion into scientific researchers right across the country and have made the largest investments in the history in things like the Tri-Councils and the National Research Council. So if you talk about capital infrastructure, you talk about funding students in undergrad and post-secondary education, you talk about actual labs where you're doing your work to make sure you have world-class skills, we're investing in all those things, and we're going to continue to do it.
Okay. Thank you, Terry. So next.
This is the question about international students, Terry. It seems to me that an essential element of a progressive university is that it is open and accessible, not just to students from Canada, but also reaching out to students around the world. That's part of the mission of a good, solid university. And in order to do that, of course, tuition has to be affordable. And not only tuition has to be affordable, but of course for many of those international students, it's not just a question of tuition, but how do we reach out and ensure that they have decent housing, how do they have support for their families, how do they get to the country as well, some of those students, right? And so I think that my priority in the issue of international students would be looking at what are the areas in which we can really demonstrate that global solidarity and do far more to support international students coming to Simon Fraser, because they also make a huge contribution to this university.
Thank you. Last word for Anita.
I would like to start by saying that life as a student is still excruciatingly difficult, so whatever progress has been made is not good enough. I think that treating international students differently from domestic students makes it so that universities can treat them differently and can use international tuition and let students in for different reasons other than just education. So I believe that everybody should be treated equally on that front. And same goes for the piling up of debt. And so we need to raise that immediately, not just lower it. And that goes for international as well as domestic students, because education is something fundamental globally, not just in Canada.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question about that for you. Okay. So this is for Terry about the question of debt that Anita just raised. So the federal policies The federal liberal policies around post-secondary education have focused on making student loans less onerous to repay, for example, lowering interest rates, increasing the grace period for repayment. So this is welcome news for students, but it's still true that students are facing an unprecedented amount of debt and financial barriers to getting their education. The amount of debt is going up every single year, as a recent report showing it's just under, the average debt is just under $30,000. So carrying that amount of debt comes with a lot of stress, risk, impact on life choices. So should a liberal government focus also on reducing the need for students to take on so much debt in the first place? And please, 2 minutes.
So I think it's important for everybody here to understand a couple of things. The first is that I spent a lot of my life working on access to education. I started a nonprofit called Twin Row Local Leaders, where we trained high school students and young university students to win scholarships to access education. So I understand the challenges the students face, and one of the things that I noticed when I was teaching over the last 7 years was just how much more difficult life was getting. And so we've taken a lot of steps to deal with that on all levels. We have a $55 billion national housing strategy. We are putting in legislation to reduce cell phone bills and wireless bills. We are increasing grants and subsidies to tuition. But you can't have it both ways, guys. Both of my competitors on the stage right now just said that they're willing to bring down the cost of international students' tuition. If you guys look at the economics of any university now, I mean, those extra tuition costs are subsidizing all the programs that are here. And so while these people are saying, hey, free tuition for everybody, free tuition for international students, you've got to think about the consequences to the quality of your education and your experience here, and the quality of the degree you're going to get, and the ability. I mean, in Canada right now, we have the strongest education system in the world. I've had the opportunity, I graduated here from SFU, I got into Oxford University, I've had the opportunity to train at Harvard and at University of Singapore. I was able to do that because this is world-class education. You do well at Simon Fraser University, you are prepared for the world, right? We need to make your life easier, there's no doubt. Students have a raw deal, right? It's tremendously harder today than it was 10 years ago, and even more hard than it was 20 years ago. But we need to, just saying that tuition is free isn't going to fix all of your issues. So we need to, 10 seconds? The other thing that I want to talk about when I have another chance is talking about what you do after your degree. Because we're looking at investing in lifelong education and in advanced programs for job placements, not just for degree students, but also for trades.
So I'd like to follow up on this question of how would we pay for it. So this is going to be a question for Sven and Anita. So the NDP and the Green Party have called for free tuition at post-secondary institutions, that's again tonight. And really, how do we make it happen? So traditionally, higher education has been a provincial responsibility. And in the early 90s, the federal government used the current system where there are block grants to provide for assistance with higher education costs. So what legal and financial mechanisms would an NDP or Green government use to ensure that post-secondary tuition doesn't need to become free across Canada? So we'll start with Sven.
So this is addressed to each candidate, is it? Or?
No,
Just okay. Yeah, you asked about legal mechanisms and financial mechanisms. The question is really about affordability and priorities, not about whether you can do it or not. If post-secondary education is in fact identified as a priority by the federal government, then the question is, where do we get the resources? And I want to come back to what I said before. There are resources available, and the fundamental issue, take the wealth tax, for example. The wealth tax is an interesting one on estates of $20 million. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, which is the independent officer of Parliament, has said that over the course of a decade, that would raise over $70 billion. $70 billion. Some of that money, in fact, can go to post-secondary education and helping to reduce the costs. The other point I would make is that this is a partnership that we're talking about. Our platform is called for us to work in partnership with the provinces, obviously, and working with other sectors as well to try to drive down the cost of education. Not going to happen overnight, but it is an absolutely critical objective. And that wealth tax, together with fairer taxes, for example, capital gains taxes, one of the population, the top 1% of the population, it's 88% of the benefit of capital gains taxes. Let's put some of that into post-secondary education as well. So wealth tax, I think, is a critically important one. I have to say I was disappointed that the Green Party momentarily had a wealth tax in their platform, and then it mysteriously vanished from the website, and there is no wealth tax in the Green Party platform. I would have thought that that would have been an important element of their policy of driving down the cost of education as well, and I hope it might be.
Yeah, we actually did keep it. We just, for whatever reason, our final document doesn't have everything that's actually part of our platform. Another story. But we do have a wealth tax, and we also have a steepening marginal tax rate to make sure we get money. The other big thing is education is an investment, and it's also what drives our innovation in our economy. So right now we're putting a lot of money into fossil fuels and stuff like that. We need to immediately stop. And education is somewhere that we know will drive the innovation economy of the future. So we'll put it there instead. And especially with the technological changes that are coming, free education is no longer something that's just, something we want, but something that's going to be necessary. So also closing capital gains tax loopholes. There's a number of ways, and it really is about choice and what we choose to invest in. And I hope that what we choose to invest in is our own people.
Thanks. So, Terry, would you like to have a brief follow-up to the two statements before we move on to the next another topic?
No, I'm good for now.
Next set of questions about housing and affordability, another angle on the financial situation of students. So rents have been going up rapidly. This has made it tough for students to live anywhere near SFU or UBC, and added to the stress, especially for students with families, high debt levels. High construction costs have reduced the ability of universities to construct new student housing, leading to high residence rates for students. Is there anything the federal government can do to make undergraduate and graduate student housing on and off campus more affordable? Maybe you could everyone could speak to that for about 2 minutes, and we'll start with you, Terry. Thank you.
Yes, there's lots we can do. So the federal government hasn't invested in housing in 25 years, and that's been part of the problem. So the first actual presentation that I gave to our Prime Minister and to our National Caucus was actually on the housing crisis. And it was because I had families coming into my office saying, hey, I'm afraid that our kids aren't going to be able to live here. And then I had CEOs coming in saying, hey, our employees are having to move further and further away. We're not even sure if we should renew our leases. So it was the economic elephant that was in the room for every conversation. And at the start of my term, I think in the first year, housing prices went up by 20% and 16%. We introduced something called a stress test, and we've seen that housing prices have leveled out a little bit in Vancouver. We put $55 billion into this national housing strategy. It's going to reduce homelessness by 50%, but invest in all sides of the spectrum, including student housing. We've dedicated $68 million to take on the money laundering problem. We, of course, lower taxes for the middle class, and we're suggesting that we increase the tax exemption so that Canadians don't pay taxes on their first $15,000. That's going to mean 700,000 Canadians no longer have to pay any taxes at all. In terms of affordability more generally, we're investing in pharmacare so people don't have to choose between their food and their drugs. We've invested in public infrastructure and transit so you guys don't have to wait so long in traffic. We're investing in childcare to make sure that if you have children while you're studying or afterwards, that you're going to be able to get yourself back into the workforce. These are real investments that we've made in the last 4 years that are making Canadian lives better, making life more affordable. It's a problem that's been built up for 25 years, and what was left over from a huge social, economic, and environmental deficit from the Conservative government before us. We're on the right track, and we just need to keep going further.
Yeah, this crisis is awful. I'm living it. I've just finished a degree and I can barely afford my rent. I'm looking for a job. There aren't any. There aren't enough. So housing is the cornerstone of this of the affordability crisis. And so what we need to do is have a national housing strategy that is centered around housing being a human right and home being a human right. So everyone actually has somewhere to go and somewhere to be. And that means every single type of housing needs support. So this would be, in our case, making sure there's new affordable units, refurbished affordable units, student housing, seniors housing, co-op housing strategy. And really what I feel more than anything, and I know people that are my friends feel this way as well, is that we are so put out by the way that housing is dealt with now that we don't need to ever own a home. We just want the guarantee of somewhere to live. So we're ready for social housing, and we'd rather have that. We'd rather have a home than the possibility of thinking about ownership in the future.
And yeah, and I agree with Amita in their comments on social housing. I want to say a couple of things. First of all, if you do the math, Terry said that for the last 25 years, there hasn't been any leadership whatsoever in housing. And you know what? He's absolutely right. 9 of those years were conservative. 16 of those years were liberal years, Terry, right? Including the last 4 years. And in the last 4 years, despite the promises that were made in 2015 to tackle the housing crisis, do you know how many units has the federal government supported? How many units has the federal government supported of housing, federal government supported housing in Burnaby North-Seymour? Not a single one. Not one, right? And if Terry's got an example of something they've supported, I'd love to hear it, but they haven't supported anything. So if housing is a basic human right, it means, first of all, the market can't deliver, because the market's really good at luxury condominiums, but they're not good at delivering nonprofit cooperative housing, affordable housing, student housing, senior housing. None of that has been built. And despite the announcement that was made about housing, have a look at the Burnaby Now newspaper from today. The front page story reads this: Hurley, the mayor, is frustrated with the feds on housing file. And what did he say? He said, the mayor says that money has been completely inaccessible, right? That's the federal liberal government. Money is not accessible to our community. We have a crisis. There's no question about it. We've got to start building that housing. Federal government has got to provide the leadership in building that housing. And certainly, if it's a basic human right, part of that is going to be student housing. When I've been door knocking and I see 3, 4, 5 people crammed into a little basement suite, that's not accessible. That's not decent housing. When I see my nephew who can't afford to live in the community that he grew up in, that's wrong. Housing's a human right, and it's time a government recognized that.
Do I get to respond to that? All right. So first of all, this is one of the things, we have to make sure we do this in a fiscally responsible way. $55 billion is a lot of money. We're talking about 25 years ago, we're talking about a Canada that had a net debt to GDP ratio of over 90%. We had to make cuts across the board, otherwise our fiscal house was completely out of whack. We're now at 30%, which gives us the fiscal room to invest that $55 billion. When you're talking about investing $55 billion, you can't just spend that money wherever you want to go, especially when there's been no housing structure for the last 25 years. You have to talk to people and come up with a plan to make sure that that money is being spent in the most accurate way. And in terms of what's happening here in Burnaby North-Seymour, the mayor wants to build 1,000 plus affordable units here. We've been meeting monthly on it. The startup funding and the funding that's going to make that housing available is actually hinging on the rezoning that the city council has to pass. So as soon as they pass it, the meeting was mid-September, those funds are starting to flow. So Burnaby North-Seymour is going to get more than its fair share of housing.
Hasn't had a single unit so far, Terry.
There, over 1,200 units have been invested in since I've been in power.
So the next question is about a bigger picture question about graduate student wages. Graduate students have struggled for years because their wages have not matched the cost of living increases. Graduate students know they are signing up for a life of, let's say, simple living for a few years, but many have serious difficulty paying their rent, even buying food. The Graduate Student Society has an emergency grocery card program that sees hundreds of users each year. What do you see, what kind of connections do you see between Metro Vancouver's general crisis in housing and affordability, how graduate students are treated as workers, and the ability of universities to fulfill their mandates in education? So I'd like to start with Amita, please. Oh, and sorry, since this is a more open-ended question, we'll go for 3 minutes each.
That's deeply personal, because I spent the last 5 years scraping by on a graduate student salary. And I was in California. So I moved back about a year and a half ago, but I was in California in the Bay Area, also experiencing an affordability crisis. And it's awful. It's a fight. It is everything. And yet you, as a grad student, are the backbone of students' educations. It's all the work that's done pretty much in research. Not all, I should be nicer to the professors, but as a grad student, you do a huge amount of work. It's backbreaking for nothing. And you're treated like some interim person between student and fully, adult individual in society, which is not where we really are. You're a full person as part of the economy, but that's not how you're treated. So when you stack the affordability crisis on top of that, you're just crushing people, and you're crushing people that are doing the most work. So it's absolutely something we need to look into and make sure that we talk about a living wage for everyone. And so we want a guaranteed living wage, and that would work on that. But without that, we also need to say that grad students are workers as anyone else, and we deserve the same rights and pay and ability to deal with this affordability crisis. And the amount of extra strain that grad students have because of the amount of work they have, the TAing, it spreads through the rest of the academic system. So we need a holistic view of it, and it affects everybody. And yeah, it was tough.
So when it comes to grad students, it is a struggle. There's no doubt about that. And we're investing in a whole bunch of different parts of graduate life to make it more affordable. So I mentioned that we put a historic amount of money into our scientists and researchers. That's hitting grad students the most. So there's more positions available, there's more funding available. People are actually able to get their labs up and running and get their work done, and more positions are available for people that are seeking out those positions. We're investing in housing, as I said. We're investing in childcare, which is also a lot more important for graduate students because a lot of graduate students with families. We're investing in public transit so people can get to and from where they need to go, but also student housing. The other thing that we're investing in is making sure that there's a strong job market for after you graduate. You look at companies like Stem Cell here in Burnaby North-Seymour. This is a company that's expanding to 1 million square feet. It's hiring tons of graduate students right here out of SFU. 4,000 jobs, the largest job announcement that we've had in the history of the riding. And those jobs are 6-figure jobs right on the SkyTrain line, jobs where people can afford to live here. We need to continue to make sure we have the quality of life here to attract companies like that and make sure that you guys have not just a reasonable life while you're a graduate student, but an exceptional life after you graduate.
Yeah, and I just want to thank Amita, because I think their exposition of the realities of living as a graduate student was very powerful, and I can't really add to that. I lived as a grad student myself in London for a while, and they're absolutely right about the challenges that one faces. Just a couple of things that I would want to add. One, and Terry mentioned, the importance of housing, obviously, student housing, and that grad students, like all students, have access to that affordable housing. Taking on money laundering and speculation is something else that we've got to get serious about if we're serious about tackling the housing crisis. A lot of those luxury condominium buildings are half empty, because people aren't living in them because they're owned by speculators. The money laundering unit that the RCMP put together didn't have any staff until just recently, when the Attorney General of British Columbia said, hey, actually staff the money laundering unit. And fortunately now there is that collaboration, but that didn't exist before. So housing is obviously a critically important one. Childcare, incredibly important as well. We've just announced recently a $10 billion program over 4 years that would create 500,000 units of childcare, affordable childcare, $10 and less childcare. Katrina Chen, the MLA and the Minister of State for Childcare in British Columbia, has been doing a fantastic job at the provincial level, but we need a federal partner in that as well. And then the last thing I would want to say is recently we heard some really staggering figures about poverty in Burnaby North-Seymour. Almost half of the single-parent families in our community are living in poverty. That's completely unacceptable. Too many of those people are graduate students, no doubt about it, with single-parent families. We've got to deal with that. And of course, The other kind of elephant in the room, if I can say so, Oliver, is that I think the university itself has got to do a better job in paying more respect to grad students, right? It's not just about government. There's a lot of fat at the top in this university. I've seen it. And if there's going to be more equity, let's pay a little more respect and make sure that grad students, for example, are paid better wages for the work they do as well.
I'll agree to that one as well. And I also agree about childcare. We need universal childcare. And I also want to give a shout out to those of us that are not having kids because of the climate crisis. So I'd like some mental health support on that front as well. What I wanted to respond to here was the idea that the way that scientific funding has happened is actually supportive of grad students. I disagree on that. I think that the way that we've had scientific funding over the last 4 years, I love the research chair program. I love the reinjection of funding into science, but it's been very targeted, which actually avoids full funding of all the graduate students that do a lot of fundamental research that drive our system.
Regarding the environment and climate change. Okay, so this is a question to everyone. What more should the federal government be doing to combat climate change, both in terms of national, international policy? 2 minutes each, please. If you could speak to that, Terry. We'll see first.
2 minutes is not a lot of time. In the last 4 years, and I say this without hyperbole, our government has taken more action on climate change and the environment than any government in the history of the country. And Canada is emerging as a world leader. And I would describe that as the down payment for what we need to do going forward. Just to give you some figures, we put a price on pollution, a national price on pollution. We had to fight every inch to get that through the House and pass the Conservatives. We're phasing out coal and fossil fuel subsidies. We're banning single-use plastics by 2021. We're investing in renewable energy and electrification. We've started with cars, but you're going to see it in trucks, homes, offices, boats, trains, and planes. We invested in Oceans Protection Plan. We changed the Oceans Act. When I took power, less than 1% of our oceans were protected in Canada. Now we're at 14%, and we're committed to get to 25% by 2025, all water and all land. We've banned oil and gas drilling in the Arctic. We put $167 million into our endangered whale strategy, $142 million into our wild salmon fund, $750 million into tertiary waste treatment so that we're not just dumping our waste into the Burrard Inlet. We've created a low carbon fund, and I personally have been the parliamentary secretary on all 5 major pieces of environmental legislation that have gone through the House, including restoring protections to the Fisheries Act, the Oceans Act, the Hazardous and Derelict Vessels Act, the Oil Tanker Moratorium, revising environmental assessments, and bringing back the Navigable Waters Act. I didn't go to Ottawa as an environmentalist. I went more as a business person, but the business case for protecting our water, air, and soil and the future generations that are going to come after us is so strong that I came back as one.
Well, you know, they declared a climate emergency one day in Parliament, and then the next day they announced the approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. And there's something wrong with that picture, right? There's something very wrong. The IPCC has given us 11 years to meet those targets. And if we don't meet those targets, we are betraying the trust and the future of our children and our grandchildren. And people like Greta Thunberg has very powerfully, of course, made that argument. I was honored to be out with the climate strikers last Friday, speaking out strongly for a Green New Deal which would say that there will be no new resources going into fossil fuels in this country, that we will end immediately all fossil fuel subsidies, that we will not proceed with the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. And by the way, in 2015, Terry and Justin made a promise to the people of this constituency. They made 2 promises. They first of all said that this project wouldn't go ahead if the community didn't agree and if Indigenous peoples didn't agree. And secondly, they said they wouldn't use the Harper environmental assessment procedure. Well, guess what? They used the discredited Harper environmental assessment procedure, and it was thrown out by the federal court. They ignored the wishes of the people of this community. They betrayed the trust of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in the heart of this constituency and the Squamish people who've said this project is a threat to them. The reality is that instead of that, they bought the pipeline for $4.5 billion. They're going to put another $10 billion into it. I say shame on the Liberal government for not respecting the people of this community.
We really can't fit this all in 2 minutes. Yeah, we're facing a crisis and we have to do everything we possibly can. And that means meeting our Paris targets by 2030 of reduction of 60%, which right now we're the only ones, unfortunately, that have a plan to do that. So we're pushing everyone to get there. And the importance of meeting the earlier target rather than just the later target is people are already suffering across the globe. People in the global south are already losing their homes, their lives, everything. And so every moment and every action we can take is necessary and will alleviate suffering. So the way we see this starts with a just transition at home. This starts with full respect for Indigenous rights and sovereignty, implementation of UNDRIP, and a lot more than that. So easily ending all fossil subsidies, full transition into a green economy. And I also want to bring up that, yeah, we're following Greta now, but people have been talking about this for a long time. And they're mostly Indigenous voices and voices of color that have not been being listened to. So what we need in this is an intersectional lens, and we can't leave a single person behind. We need to face the reality that we're in and take every single step we possibly can, use every moment we possibly can, and don't take anything less than that as an answer.
Thank you. So the next question is for Terry specifically.
I don't get to respond to that?
Well, the question is about the Trudeau government and the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So I think you can use part of your time to respond.
All right.
So many people have criticized the Trudeau government for purchasing the pipeline, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. There have been comments on the connection between developing fossil fuel infrastructure and the difficulty of meeting greenhouse gas targets. What is your stance on the pipeline and its expansion? Do you think the issue has been handled well in Ottawa?
How long do I have?
2 minutes.
Okay. So a couple of things. First of all, it is any member of Parliament's first and foremost responsibility to represent their constituents. And for the last 4 years, I have done that every single day. When this issue was discussed in Ottawa and the Prime Minister did the approval in the first time, he came out and said, I've heard the diverse perspectives that exist in BC on this project. Indeed, one of its most articulate and substantive critics is a caucus colleague, Terry Beach. If you go through all of these, I mean, Sven said that there was no revised NEB process. There was extra hearings. It's just that no member of the NDP participated in them. I went in Burnaby. We had 3 full days of hearings. That was our chance as a community to come out and raise these concerns. And I was there every single minute, and not a single NDP MP showed up. And then I went to North Vancouver and presented our concerns to the community. You can go onto my website, terrybeach.ca, and read that presentation. I can go through 6 pages of how I stood up for this community. There's tons of reports that I've written on this, and there's tons of things that I've been working on that I've been able to pull across the line for this community. Let us not forget that when this came up to a vote in the House, it was 252 in favor and 51 against. And so when we're talking about who's actually going to be able to have a seat at the table and represent you guys and pull things across the line when we talk about fighting climate change, when we talk about protecting the ocean, when we talk about dealing with the tank farm in Burnaby Mountain, you need to take a look at our records and the work that we've actually done. I voted against this because I said that I would support my community over the party. And I promised that in the last election in a debate like this, and I've stood by that. So please, don't just listen to a bunch of people who are going to convince you that they're going to be the most angry person on this issue. Think about who's going to be the most effective person on this issue. And the last thing that I would say is when it comes to climate change. There was a report came out today, October 3rd, talked about the feasibility of the NDP plan, the Conservative plan, the Green plan, and the Liberal plan. And just quickly, the Conservative plan feasibility, F, the Liberal plan, A, the NDP plan, D, and the Green plan, C minus. So make sure you do your research and know what you're voting for.
Great. So this is a good time, I think, to go to Swend. You have mentioned the Green New Deal. Can you expand on that? And how would you overcome opposition from industry, oil, gas sectors, but also from voters who are skeptical about big government action? And I think it's all connected to what we've been talking about for 2 minutes.
You're thinking of companies like SNC Lavalin, for example, are you? Yeah. I want to say something about the pipeline, because Terry has said, you want somebody who's effective. Well, the fact of the matter is that the great climate champion, Justin Trudeau, is pushing this pipeline through. And there are only two ways to stop it. One is in the courts, and hopefully the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the other challenge will be successful. But the second is if there is, in fact, after October 21st, a minority government. And if there is a minority government, New Democrats have made it very clear, and the Green Party has made it very clear, that if they want support from us, that pipeline project will not go ahead. And that's the way to stop it, not to elect a Liberal member of Parliament. The last thing we need is another Liberal member of Parliament who's going to vote confidence in the great climate champion Justin Trudeau, and that pipeline goes ahead, and it's a threat to this university. The Burnaby Fire Department has been very clear on that. In terms of the Green New Deal, I think this is a really exciting opportunity for us to transition away in a respectful way. We've got to work with the workers that are directly affected, because they've got families and they've got futures as well. But we can do it in a way that, for example, means that we do energy retrofitting that saves, spares greenhouse gases. We can certainly transition to renewable energy in a very exciting way. Transit is a very important thing, and certainly on the North Shore, I think all of us agree that's been the big issue, is getting support for public transit. But we need a government with the courage to stand up to those big fossil fuel industries, instead of a government like the Trudeau government that has met over 800 times with lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry. That's not the kind of relationship that builds a government that says, we'll take on the oil and gas industry, we'll take on big pharma, and we'll put people before corporate profits.
So, Terry, if you would like a brief follow-up, and then we'll give the last word on climate change to Amita. If you like. Yeah.
Sure. How many people here have read the Green New Deal as proposed by AOC in the United States? Right? Absolutely. Okay. So when you go through there, you would have noticed that over 85% of the policies in there are current contemporary Canadian policies that are being pursued by the Liberal government. And, Sven can insult Justin Trudeau, but there are a lot of constraints when it comes to our political system. And right now, we have somebody that's vying to be prime minister that doesn't care about climate change, doesn't want to invest in the environment, is going to scrap environmental laws. Our prime minister, over the last 4 years, has been able to thread that line of growing the economy and protecting the environment at the same time. And that's a hard line to draw, because, okay, just one sentence closing point. If we go too hard too fast, and if people don't feel like they're getting ahead, we get a situation like it's going on in the United States, right, where they're trying to make coal great again. Right? We have seen real effective change over the last 4 years, and we have promised that we're going to do more. And things like that climate strike that we all participated in last week, that's going to give us the mandate to do more. But we have to work within the system that we're currently governed in.
Thank you. So, Mita, on the new Green Deal, the Green Party has promised to balance the federal budget within 5 years, mostly with new taxes, not cuts in services. But interest rates on government bonds are very low, 1.3, 1.6%, below inflation. In this financial climate, what is wrong with running deficits to invest in, for example, environmental infrastructure?
Nothing is wrong. So we don't actually oppose having deficits in those cases. The hope would be that if we can, we'll balance the budget, but we're in a bunch of emergencies, so we won't otherwise do that. So we're happy to run deficits to solve our crises and then deal with them. So I have to address a number of things here. And one is that we have a Canadian Green New Deal. It's not the same as the US Green New Deal. And that's what I support. And I believe Sven also supports it. And it's built for us. It's a way to work in a completely nonpartisan way to make sure that we meet our targets and we respond in a just way to our climate emergency. And I have a problem when people say our plans aren't doable because they're necessary. Do they work in people's current economic framework? No, but we can't continue in our current economic framework. We need regenerative systems. We need regenerative economies that last for generations. So the other problem is, of course, the pipeline. We can't have it. It doesn't work. And I would challenge the people, Terry, on this. I'm sorry, but I know you voted against the pipeline, but I believe that you voted against the implementation of UNDRIP in the pipeline process, which means, because I believe it's in your voting record. We can check on that, but that's what I've read. So what I would like to do right now is challenge the other members on stage with me to say that as much as we might oppose the pipeline, whichever one of us ends up being MP, we don't know the amount of power that we're going to have. So I want us to now promise that we will minimally make sure that we get the tanks upgraded to modern standards. Will you both promise that with me?
The tanks in the tank?
Yeah, the tanks in the tank farm. Will you?
Well, I mean, we were at a meeting down by the tank farm a few hundred meters last night, and I made the point that the existing tanks, 6 of the existing tanks, do not meet the basic standards. And most importantly, Trans Mountain has said that they don't have to meet seismic standards. They don't have to upgrade those to current standards. And that's completely unacceptable.
Well, my position is actually that the tank farm needs to get off the mountain in the first place. So that's my official position. But yeah, absolutely. Everything that, if that project goes ahead, we need to make sure that our fire department and our mayor and our city and all the officials that are around it live up to the standard that the Prime Minister promised, which was world-class standards. Now, it's a hard thing to debate at this time because those are things that are currently being negotiated. We had a huge town hall on this last night. But if you want to get into the details, go to terrybeach.ca. My speech from last night on the tank farm is there. It has over 275 pages of reference material, and you can see a very detailed plan on what are the key issues around this particular project.
Okay, thank you. So one more question, local question about related to the climate, the gondola. So, So both student societies at SFU have endorsed the Burnaby Mountain Gondola project. Would be an alternative transit route for the about 35,000 people who need to get up here almost every day. Great environmental benefits, replace diesel buses, save millions of hours of commute time, and stop us from getting stuck in the winter. If you are elected as member of parliament for this riding, would you support and seek approval for this project? This is for everyone, about 1 minute each. And I think we'll start with Amita.
We want to make sure that we can give as much funding as possible to public transit projects. I don't think it's up to me to decide on this project at all. I think it seems cool and definitely seems like the right environmental approach, but there are concerns along the route. So I think it's up to the community as a whole to figure out if it's what they want. And if it's what you all want, then I'll support it.
I have a minute. I'm regretting in all of our climate talk not mentioning that we are now committed to being a net zero country by 2050 with legislated 5-year targets. I can't believe I haven't said that yet. But anyways, when it comes to the gondola, I provided a letter of support to the mayor and council in July. I posted that letter of support to my website. It also talks about some of the concerns from residents in Forest Grove and in the university area. There are multiple routes that are proposed. I believe that there's going to be a public hearing process. It's going to start getting into that. And so my support contingent on addressing those concerns of the community is publicly posted on my website. You can download it from there.
I agree. I think that that's the key to this, is that in principle, absolutely, we have to do it in a way that is respectful and recognizes the concerns of communities that are affected. And I know that the city of Burnaby and TransLink are trying to establish a process to consult with the community to do that. But in principle, I think it's a great idea. I think also that we have to go further, though, and recognize that as part of federal government leadership in fighting the climate crisis, this is a project that would make a significant contribution to reducing greenhouse gases. And I'd certainly like to see some strong federal government support for this project, as well as for a fixed link crossing to the North Shore as well. I think those would be two projects that the federal government should support.
I think we have time for a couple of questions before we go into the audience participation part. So first one is to everyone. Can you name one policy in your federal party platform that you disagree with and why? And since this may be somewhat painful, we limit it to 1 minute each. So, okay, Terry, would you like to go first?
This is going to surprise all of you. When I ran for office, I did not expect to become the Canadian expert in pipeline politics. Obviously, my life would be way simpler without the Trans Mountain Pipeline. That being said, when you're a politician and when you're responsible for the collective futures of 107,000 people, and never mind working in a group for the country, you don't get to decide what cards you play with. You play with the hand that you're dealt, and you do the best you can with those cards. And that's what I've done each and every day, and that's what I will continue to do if you continue to trust me with your vote.
I'm honestly not really sure. So I'm going to go and talk about something that's talk about things that are in our policy book, but are not exactly in our platform. And I have to say that as a scientist, I don't think that our nuclear policy or our GMO policy is nearly good enough or as nuanced as it should be.
Yeah, it's not so much a disagreement, but it's an area where I think that we have to be clearer as a party, and that is, if we're serious about the climate crisis, as I know we all are, and if we say that we have to end all fossil fuel subsidies, I think we've got to explicitly say that as part of that end to all fossil fuel subsidies, that would include the $275 million federal subsidy that is currently going to support the BC LNG project. I think that should in fact be cut. And as part of that sort of broader approach, I think we should also be very clear and explicit that we oppose fracking, that we say fracking is a destructive environmental practice, and finally that we have to be clearer, and again, it's not a disagreement, because I know that Jagmeet has been very powerful in terms of Indigenous rights and UNDRIP, but I think we have to be clearer in recognizing, as part of the concern around the LNG project, we have to recognize that the rights of Indigenous peoples, particularly the hereditary chiefs and UNDRIP, have to be fully respected and honored, and I think we've got to be clear in that as well.
So, in fact, the last question before the audience participation part is about Indigenous rights. So we began to debate with land acknowledgement. In your view, what are the most important steps that the federal government should take now to move towards reconciliation with Indigenous people? Can you speak about how reconciliation is connected with education, housing affordability, environment, the issues we've discussed tonight? So with 2 minutes each, please, and I think we'll start with Sven, since he was already opening that issue.
Sure, and I think this is one of the most important issues that we face in this election campaign. And there are a number of specific areas. One, of course, is implementing all of the recommendations of the Reconciliation Commission. I think there were some 94 different recommendations that must be honored and respected. Certainly as well, honoring and respecting the recommendations and the powerful recommendations of the Missing and Murdered Women's, Indigenous Women's Inquiry, and accepting their conclusion that what took place, in fact, was a genocide. There's no question about that. And the shame that we have to respond to that in a meaningful way, recognizing the importance of providing more support for children. And Cindy Blackstock shouldn't have to continuously appeal against the Liberal government when the Liberal government will not implement decisions of human rights tribunals. It is shameful that there still are boil water advisories in Canada. I mean, I can't believe this, that we still, to this day, have boil water advisories. There should be clean water for everybody, including Indigenous people. Certainly, it is not the role of SNC-Lavalin to provide that clean water. I must say, Amita, you know, there was a suggestion by your leader that maybe SNC-Lavalin should provide that. That's the role of government, to provide decent water and infrastructure for everybody. And finally, I think we have to recognize the importance of a nation-to-nation relationship here, and that as part of that relationship, it means respect. And the way that we have approached the issue in this constituency of the pipeline has shown a total lack of respect for the Tsleil-Waututh and the Squamish people, and that must change as well.
So, Amita, would you like to speak to reconciliation?
Yeah, I'm going to rebut that first and say that's not our official policy at all. It would be that they need to be punished in some way and maybe should fund it. So Indigenous rights and sovereignty is something that we've never done right because we are a colonial nation. Every single structure that we exist under is colonial, our government is colonial, every party is colonial. And I feel it. Our hierarchies don't work. So we need to start by implementing all the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, absolutely UNDRIP, which includes free, prior, informed consent, as well as all the recommendations of missing, murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. But that's not really enough. And we right now have a constitution that is incredibly racist. And the way that rights are, they aren't rights for Indigenous people in this country. So we need to look at healthcare, we need to look at absolutely everything. And yes, it needs to be nation to nation, but I find every time I speak of this that my words ring as hollow as anyone else's before me. So our promises have always been empty, and they have to stop.
Harry,
Please, thank you. Our promises certainly have not been empty over the last 4 years. We have not only invested in a renewed relationship with First Nations peoples right across the country, we have not only invested billions of dollars in infrastructure, policing, health and education, etc., but we are committed to the principles of UNDRIP. And by the way, it passed a third reading and failed in the Senate, so it only gets through if the government supports it. It's another reason why we can't let Andrew Scheer appoint the next generation of Conservative senators and continue to control the second house. We're committed to implementing the conditions in, or not the conditions, the recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation Framework, the Missing Murdered Women's Inquiry. And our approach is based on empowerment. It's based on rights recognition, self-governance. You're right, it's a shame that those boil water advisories have been on for so long. We've invested $2 billion in the last 4 years, and we've lifted 87 of those boil water advisories, and we are on track to lift all boil water advisories by 2021. Yeah, it took 4 years to do it. Those are remote northern communities. When I was Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries, I spent a lot of time going to Indigenous communities and educating myself on the challenges in these communities and meeting with Indigenous people in urban areas as well. I mean, I don't try to use their name, but if you listen to Sven talk about it, you would think that I have some sort of backwards relationship with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. My relationship with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation has been one of the greatest privileges of the last 4 years of my time in government. And we have worked on tremendous things together in healthcare, in education, in housing. And the Tsleil-Waututh Nation are doing incredibly well. And I was the first to thank the Tsleil-Waututh Nation for their work of putting the Trans Mountain Pipeline in through the courts, because it's making our processes better so that we can make better decisions as we go forward and not repeat the same mistakes of the past. We spent 152 years doing relationships with Indigenous people wrong. We've taken 4 years to correct that and turn it around. And we're going to continue on that path, and we're going to make sure that Indigenous people, 10 years from now, 25 years from now, 50 years from now, are the most empowered group in this country and can be the future leaders of this country.
Great. So this concludes the questions from the platform, and we're going to move into the audience question part. I think we'll take a 5-minute break or so, get some water, go to the bathroom, okay, and then I'll move to the Slido. So please, everyone, if you have questions, post on Slido, vote for questions you agree with. Thank you. Okay, are we ready? Yes, good. So we have is the sound good? Too quiet? Trying this. This sounds louder. Okay. Too loud? No. Okay, good. Okay. All right. Well, since we're high-tech with Slido, we have some poll questions. First one, how did the candidates respond to the first part of the debate? And we got average, above average. Pretty good. I can say I'm glad they're not doing this while I'm teaching, so. Okay. So we got a good turnout. Thank you very much for all the questions. Let me start. Maybe there were a number following up on the last topic we raised, reconciliation, specifically about murdering murdered and missing Indigenous women, the inquiry, the recommendations, and maybe we can all speak to what you would do specifically to address the record of Canada and our shortcomings with regard to Indigenous people. I think we'll start with Amita and then move Terry and Sven. Thank you. About 1 minute.
We have to implement all the recommendations in the report. I think it also really highlights the lack of equity that we have in our country, both in terms of racial discrimination and racism, as well as in terms of gender. Two of the things that I know we have full plans for implementing are guaranteed livable income and safe transportation to rural areas. But really, it speaks to the need to admit genocide and admit the realities that people face, and that we have to examine our own lives and the systems we live in, the way we participate in society, and implementing the recommendations will be part of that process.
I agree with everything that Amita just said. We have to implement all the recommendations for certain. And I think this goes back to what I was saying just before we closed. I mean, this is really going to be about empowerment, and not empowerment maybe in the traditional way that we think about it. It's kind of, there's a lot of Maslow hierarchy of needs here. You got to make sure that you have that security of person and that ability to invest in yourself before you can be successful. And if you go out to Indigenous communities across this country, you would not recognize it as Canada. I mean, we have Indigenous people living in third world conditions. At the same time, it's the fastest growing subset of people in this country, which means it's the greatest opportunity to improve our strength as a nation. And so if we invest in our Indigenous colleagues like we are doing, and please look into those investments, they're historic. We can really turn the corner here and do something special that will make Indigenous people stronger, but also make Canada stronger.
Okay, thank you. Sven, yeah.
I think this is one where all three of us absolutely do agree in terms of the importance of implementing all of the recommendations in a serious way of the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry. But I think we also have to go beyond that and recognize that in a number of areas, we've got a lot more work to do, and one of the most serious, of course, is the massive overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, and particularly I have to say Indigenous women in our prison systems across this country. It's shameful. Over 25% of prisoners in federal women's prison are in fact Indigenous women. And that's a massive overrepresentation. I remember when I was the justice critic for the party going in and hearing some of the stories and the devastating stories of those women. So I think restorative justice and doing whatever we can to implement in full all of the recommendations in a serious way is the key to the response.
Thank you. Good. There were a few questions around electoral reform, something we haven't touched on so far tonight. One sample that will serve as, will any of your parties commit to electoral reform or even reopening the debate? Maybe 2 minutes each. And do you want to go first?
Sure. My party does commit to that. In fact, Jagmeet Singh, as the leader of the party, recently announced that should we be in a situation of holding the balance of power in a minority government situation, that in addition to the pipeline issue, which I've already raised, and saying that that pipeline expansion project won't go ahead, that the other absolutely critical issue for us, and I think Elizabeth May has said the same thing, is in fact moving forward on keeping the promise that was made. And I remind you, that members, the promise that was made in 2015 that by Justin Trudeau, that this will be the last election on first past the post. Well, you know, that promise was betrayed, it was broken. And I know Terry says he's apologized for that, but that doesn't change the reality. The fact is that we should be moving forward, and we're committed to moving forward on a system of mixed member proportional representation that we would implement, that it would be implemented without a referendum, and that after 2 election cycles there would be a referendum. But that would reflect the will of the people of this country far more effectively than the first past the post system we have now.
Great. So I think let's move to Amita, and then Terry, you can respond sort of to both. Yeah.
Yeah, we absolutely need electoral reform. I suggest that we revolt by actually voting like that was the last election under first past the post. Be a neat trick. We also want to make sure that we have electoral reform, but we would like to have a citizens' assembly to decide what type of system we would have. A referendum does tend to be kind of sometimes problematic, as we saw in BC. So we're looking at a citizens' assembly to find a system. We are a little skeptical about too much control by party on who gets in, but that would be part of the conversation. Could I add something to the last comment? I know this takes time, but this is something I learned recently that I just wanted to share, and that we are still sending Indigenous people who call in that they're suicidal, we're sending them to prison instead of providing mental health services.
Speak to electoral reform.
Yes. So Sven's right. I do apologize for this because I went door to door in the last election and told people that it was going to be the last election that we were going to use first past the post. And there's been some other things that people have called me out on and the like, but this is one thing that I truly regret, because I apologized to all my volunteers and wrote a letter to all my constituents. I actually think that I would have an easier time getting elected under an MMP system, personally. And I'd always stated before the last election that my favorite system was any one that could be proven to provide better democratic, social, economic, and environmental outcomes. But we all need to understand what happened. I mean, it wasn't like we got into office and was like, oh, we're just not doing this anymore. There was a proportional committee that went across the country to study this issue, and the recommendations they came back with gave us an unworkable system. The Conservatives said that they will agree to the recommendations only if there is a referendum. The NDP and the Greens said that, okay, well, we're going to only agree if you have a level of proportionality behind that's underneath this current, this Gallagher index, which excluded the Prime Minister's preferred system that they were aware of. And knowing that, and knowing how the ballot was going to go, and knowing how the polls were, if we took that to referendum, we would have spent $300 million, it would have failed, and we wouldn't be talking about electoral reform for maybe a generation. And people say that's very politically opportunist of you to say that. But what did we do? We ended up having a referendum in BC, and we had a referendum in PEI, 2 of the provinces where this issue is most important, and they both failed. So we do need to find a path forward. I'm committed to finding one. I'm just not clear on what that path is at the moment. I think a citizen assembly is interesting. I think MMP is incredibly interesting. I think I could be a member of parliament for a long time under an MMP system, but let's not, oh, sorry, my time is up. I just want to make sure that everybody understands how that decision was made.
We have our second live poll of the evening. Were your concerns addressed during the debate? Yes? No? Wow, this is, when I first looked at this, was exactly 50-50. But okay, majority say yes. Good, good. Glad to hear it. Another audience question that there were a number about, well, what really sets you apart, your party, apart from the other parties? A few questions, especially about the NDP and the Greens, how they differentiate. I know this is a kind of un-Canadian question and that we might be attacking each other, but nonetheless, a lot of interest. So if you want to speak to, right, what is unique about your party and what do you disagree with most in the other party's platform? Thank you. I'll start with you, Sven.
If I have to. In terms of the Greens, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I have to say I've always had great respect for Elizabeth May's leadership on environmental issues, and she's a friend, and I've worked closely with her over many years. But in terms of the party itself, I think there's a couple of things that I would say differentiate us. Amita mentioned the importance, for example, of a representation of people of color, Indigenous peoples. Well, in fact, the NDP candidate slate this time is over 26% racialized Canadians, and the Green Party has the lowest of any party, even worse than the PPC, which I think is sad, frankly, that should be the case. I think it's also, I don't agree with their neither left nor right, but resolutely forward, right? I think we're in a climate crisis and an economic inequality crisis, and we need to be proudly progressive and not just sort of in the mushy middle. So that would be another one that I would be concerned about. And then just two other quick ones. I mean, I think that the whole issue around Bill 21 in Quebec is a very important issue. This is the bill that I think many of you know prohibits people who have any kind of religious apparel from public sector jobs. It's an outrageous bill, an infringement on democratic and religious freedom. Jagmeet Singh, as our leader, has said, of course, New Democrat candidates cannot support that bill. The leader of the Greens in Quebec, the deputy leader of the National Greens, has said it's okay if our candidates support that bill. That troubles me. That concerns me that that's not a core value. And then finally, in this constituency, I just want to say how honored I am in this constituency to have the support of some really outstanding Green leaders like David Suzuki and Sephora Berman and Naomi Klein and 350.org and Our Time. That means a lot to me.
Sorry, Amita, would you like to speak to the differences?
Yeah, so it's really interesting being one of the few people of color running with the Greens. And I have to say that diversity statistics are not the same as inclusivity. Quotas do not mean the same thing as a welcoming community. Every single party is racist. We all have our problems. We can't hide behind the numbers to deal with our true issues, and I don't think anyone is clean. The biggest differences here, I think, have to do with partisanship. And yeah, maybe I'm not the hugest, maybe I should have picked the thing that I don't agree with is our slogan, not left, not right, forward. Not a big fan, but I'm a big fan of the forward together part, because I think we do need to move forward together. My issue, and why I think I found a home with the Greens, is because of hyper-partisanship. I'm tired of the yelling. I don't feel represented at all. The system doesn't work for me. And I found a home somewhere where they weren't going to control me and where I wouldn't be forced to vote to bomb a country. So that's the difference to me. We agree on a lot of things. I support the idea of voting local, looking who your candidates are, because I also think that the bill in Quebec is a big issue. But I'm not making a decision for anyone else. I'm representing people here. So my experience is what drives me and why I ended up with the Greens. And I think that, yeah, in a lot of policy areas we're similar, but we have a very different attitude. And we all need to work better on ourselves. And numbers aren't the whole story.
Thank you. Terry? Oh, sorry.
What drew me to the Liberal Party in the first place was the underlying values of making sure that no matter where you come from, that you're given an equal chance to succeed. And all the investments that we make try to fulfill that. And I think we're one of the parties, and it's so strange to have three progressives up here and not have the conservatives and see the true dynamic of the entire country. But I think we're one of the best parties that get that balance right. In the last 4 years, we've had tremendous economic success, and we've been able to translate that into tremendous environmental success. And in terms of how I think I'm different as a parliamentarian, I've published over 1,000 pages of policy documents in the last year, and in the last 4 years. And in an age of fake news, knowing that you can come to my website and get factual information, and not a single thing of it is fraudulent or hyperbole, I think is a big thing. I think the fact that I've knocked on 100,000 doors in the last 4 years to make sure I stay in touch with my community is a big thing.
You personally?
Yeah. And I think
100,000 personally?
Oh, but the whole team, yeah. But no. I mean, you know how we track the numbers.
I just heard what you said.
Where was I? Thank you, Sven. And then I think the other thing is that the work that I've done in Ottawa and the reputation I built up there is as a trustworthy, respectable guy, a reasonable guy who can get stuff done, who has an ear of cabinet, the prime minister, and caucus, and gets along with other parties. When I was parliamentary secretary, I got amendments from the Green Party, including Elizabeth May, and from the NDP, from people like Finn Donnelly, right? I worked together with everybody. And that's why last year I was nominated for Members of Parliament as Parliamentarian of the Year in the area of civic engagement. I take an approach that if I work hard every day, if I diligently study the issues, I may not do something that everybody here agrees with, but it's my #1 job to build a trusting relationship with my constituents so that you know that you can take that burden off you, that you have somebody working hard for you in Ottawa, and that's what I do each and every day.
Thank you. Let's see. So you mentioned how there's no conservative candidate here tonight. There were quite a few questions around the conservatives. Maybe I'll pick one, which is, in lieu of having a conservative representative tonight, what do each of you have to say about their platform? Okay. It's getting laughs anyway. So, okay. So
I'm happy to start.
with you, Amita. Thanks.
Oh my goodness.
You look like you were ready to go. So.
It's terrifying. I mean, really. So I'm going to speak about their platform in general, and then I also want to speak to the views of my opponent. Yes, I can get through this in 1 minute. Their platform is terrible. They don't actually address climate change, and if we have them as a government, my rights would be erased. And I say that very seriously, even though I was a bit flippant about it, because the candidate for this riding is somebody who has said that people like me should be retrained to not be me. So I am non-binary and pansexual, and so it's really, really personal to have someone basically want to erase me. Yeah, it's a lot.
Okay, so Terry, would you like to go next?
I think it's disgraceful, just for the record, that Andrew Scheer continues to support the local candidate in this riding. I don't think he should. In terms of the actual platform, I think one of the things that conservatives like to get on their high horse about, which needs to be called out, is that they are somehow fiscally conservative when they're anything but. In the last 152 years, we've had amassed a debt of about $700 billion, and 70% of that has been accrued by just the last 2 conservative governments, under Stephen Harper and Brian Mulroney. And so I don't think we can afford another conservative government. And the other thing that I think people here should consider is that, it's great having progressive people, and I love my progressive colleagues that are up here with me. But progressive people will not help you in the House of Commons. Progressive governments are what help you. There was lots of progressive people in Ottawa when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, and that didn't stop him from muzzling scientists, making ideological policy, and horrible economic policy. So please keep that in mind.
So,
Yeah, okay, just, and I can't resist saying that even though there was a change in government, certainly the Ethics Commissioner of Parliament had something very serious to say about the ethics of the leader of the Liberal Party in his handling of Jody Wilson-Raybould, and I think that is a serious concern. But in terms of the Conservative Party and the platform, I mean, I obviously agree on the platform. I think it's really important that people understand exactly what this Conservative candidate in this constituency stands for. And it's no wonder that the Conservative Party won't let her out of a box. She's not coming to any all candidates meetings. She's not talking to anybody in the media. Why is that? Well, here's a couple of things that she's spoken out on. She recently, not that long ago, talked about how we have to stop the perverted homosexual lifestyle. She supported conversion therapy, vigorously supported conversion therapy. She is opposed to the women's right to choose on abortion, even in cases of rape. She is opposed to dying with dignity laws. We passed in the last Parliament in response to the Supreme Court, a very important law which is not still strong enough, but she's opposed to any change that allows the right to die with dignity. That's the kind of candidate that we have for the Conservative Party in this riding, and certainly I have to ask the question, how on earth can the leader of the Conservative Party allow that candidate to represent his party if he's serious about respecting the rights of people who in fact are LGBT? That's totally unacceptable.
okay. So, last question for the night. Actually, it's the one with the most votes about foreign policy, which we haven't touched on so far. I'm reading now. Canada has supplied Saudi Arabia with LAVs and arms used to brutalize the people of Yemen. How do you plan to engage in Canadian-Saudi relations? End quote. Start with Terry. We're running a little late, so 1 minute, please. Yeah.
Saudi Arabia in a minute is going to be difficult. There are contracts that were put into place by the previous government, and we are looking at ways to deal with those. But when you have a government that gets put into power and they make decisions, those decisions have consequences, very serious consequences. I think from a foreign policy standpoint in general, I just want to say that, in Canada here, and we just talked about the Conservative candidate, we are not immune from the politics of fear and division that we've seen, in the United States and in the United Kingdom. The best way that we can solve that and fight that here is to be informed, is to get involved with our democracy, but also to make sure that we invest in making sure that no Canadians are disenfranchised or feel like they aren't getting ahead. And if we do those things, we can continue to protect what is a shining gem in the world, which is our country, Canada, and we can use that to hopefully make the entire world a better place.
Thank you. And yeah, Amita, would you like to speak? Saudi Arabia relations.
Yeah, so many human rights abuses going on, and we are definitely hypocrites when it comes to that at the moment. But this means that we need to get out of our arms deals, and we also need to stop buying oil. So we need to immediately replace our systems here with renewables and biofuels to make sure we get off oil from them as soon as possible. And we need to stop selling weapons anyway, because we need peace.
Okay. So, Sven, last thing.
Yeah,
last answer.
look, it seems to me that we have to recognize that the government to which we are selling arms is a government which murdered Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist, and a government which is supporting a genocidal war in Yemen. And it is absolutely unconscionable, in my view, that our government continues to sell weapons to that murderous government. It's outrageous. And Trudeau has said, well, he's studying the issue. And he's still studying the issue, and he's been studying the issue for months. The fact of the matter is that those arms sales should be ended. we're not a shining gem. I hate to say it, Terry, but we're not a shining gem when it comes to foreign aid. The level of foreign aid, the level of international aid under this Liberal government is less than the level of international aid under the Harper government. And that's outrageous, frankly, that we don't recognize the importance of global solidarity. So on foreign aid, on sales of weapons, on entering into trade deals with the Mercosur regime, for example, the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil, our conduct in respect of Venezuela and Palestine, we are not a shining gem. We have a lot of work to do to restore integrity to foreign policy in Canada.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so let's just see. There's a poll. Did this debate help you make your decision about who you're going to vote for? 81% yes. Terry, would you like to make a brief reply?
Concluding statement, or
No, just about the shining gem. Okay.
My reply is simple. I absolutely disagree. Canada is performing as a positive force in the world in a broad number of ways. I think that we can be proud of how we've handled ourselves. Chrystia Freeland has been one of the best foreign ministers that this country has seen. We've not only handled new trade agreements in an era that has probably the most protectionistic era since the 1930s, but we've been able to put social and progressive policies in those trade agreements, and we have stood up for ourselves, and we have stood strong in some very concerning, very hard situations. And I think Canadians can actually be proud how we've responded over the last number of years. And yeah, are there things that we can improve? Absolutely. Is there any country I would trade ourselves with? Absolutely not.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll wrap up with closing statements in the reverse order from the opening statements. So that's with you, Terry. Keep going. 1 minute each, please.
So thank you, everybody, for participating in this debate. If you didn't get all the answers that you wanted to tonight, I invite any of you to meet with me individually or in a group. You can come down to my office. I'm at the corner of Hastings and Gamma. Anytime. We're open every day of the week. You can also go to my website, terrybeach.ca. And in all of these topics that we're talking about, I have detailed reports, not from the party. These are reports that I've written myself about the work that we've done right here in Burnaby and in North Vancouver. From the economy to the environment, to how we're improving affordability, to how we're investing in infrastructure, to how we're supporting our seniors, to how we're protecting your pensions for when you eventually need them. There's some people in here that need the pensions. So please, the best thing that you can do, look at all the candidates, Google everybody, get really informed on the work that we've actually done over the last 4 years and what we're promising to do in the next 4. And if you have any questions, just follow up with me anytime. Thank you.
Okay, Sven, closing statement, please.
Sure. Thanks very much. And I just want to thank the Simon Fraser Student Society and the Grad Students Society for hosting the conference, Oliver, you for moderating it, and most of all, of course, thank all of you for being here tonight. It's been a great evening. I think I've certainly learned. I hope that you found it productive, and I want to echo what Terry said as well about getting involved. This is, I believe, the most important election that this country's ever facing, because the issues, whether it's on the climate crisis, whether it's on growing inequality, those issues are obviously front and center in terms of the future of our planet. And so I welcome your involvement. My office is just down at the bottom of the mountain by Hastings and Sperling. Come and get involved, volunteer, but most important, in this election, please make sure you get out and vote, because vote like your life depends on it, because it and the lives of your children and grandchildren do depend on it. Thank you.
And Amita, please. Yep.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. It was great to have this opportunity. I want to briefly tell you why I got into politics. I did so because I've worked for a long time in diversity in the academy, and because I felt completely unrepresented. But more than anything, within myself, I felt a huge frustration of not having the power to do something about it when people were suffering across our world. So that's why I'm here, and I invite you to join me on this political journey to check it out. But what I am now realizing my job is to do is to work from the inside of a deeply colonial government and structure and actually work to decolonize it, work to bring an intersectional lens, and work to actually represent people who currently have no voice. And I don't want to do that by being there. I want to do that by making space and actually working to change what is currently a broken democracy. Thank you.
So, okay, that's great. So that concludes our event. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for participating in Canadian democracy. Another way you can participate in Canadian democracy, as Sven said, is by voting. You can vote on campus starting this weekend. Let's have a big hand. Thank you very much to our candidates.